This is only half the length of the one we had this morning, and I have substantially reduced and altered this view of history, as it were. But it's still totally biblical. So here we go. Yes. Well, the title that I've given this is Forgetting to Remember. And that's my problem as I've got older. If only I could remember that I forget, life would be so much easier. Forgetting to remember, some reflections on the loss of a Christian memory, with particular reference to the importance of understanding and remembering our Christian heritage. We see lots of TV programs, at least we do in England, I expect you to have here, about archaeological digs, and that's fascinating and crucially important. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And then there were some dramatic ones about the Spanish Armada and that sort of those episodes in history and the Crimean War and whatnot. But you don't really get history from watching a film. You get exciting pictures and you get thrills or whatever it may be, but one really has to read. You have to read. Again, we come back to reading. We can't do without reading. We can't do without reading. And as there are so many books, it's extraordinarily difficult, I think especially for young people, to know where to begin. Indeed, they may even ask a prior question, what's it worth? Is it worth bothering to begin? After all, there are these films, and I can buy videos and whatnot and so on. And there is this existential view of history, which is now sharpened into a postmodern view of history, which is really, when it comes down to it, don't believe anything about the past. Live only in the present. Live only in the present. The only past you have are your parents, and they're right in the past, aren't they? Right in the past. So don't worry about the past. It doesn't exist anymore. That apart from the tremendous arrogance, the arrogance in that statement, and one must say that word arrogance not with anger, but with pity, the arrogance of that statement, and similar remarks about history. When one goes to university, the odd university lecture that one's enabled to go to, when you go up to a university, a public lecture or something, then history will be it won't be on the agenda. You'll find it very hard. There'll be the history, say, of a small village, a whole small village around Oxford, if you're unfortunate to go to Oxford to hear a lecture, or if you go to Cambridge, where you're very fortunate to hear a lecture, you'll have a history of the village, or the things that were found in the ground, pots and bits of clay and so on, but nothing much more solid than that, and that's not very solid. And where Christians are concerned, in recent times, we've witnessed, and we're still witnessing, the consequences first of the loss of a Christian mind. If you've lost a Christian mind, and we're not looking through biblical spectacles at the world in which we live and the world behind us, then why are we concerned? How can we be concerned or bothered in any way about the loss of a Christian memory? If we're troubled, if we have no awareness that we've lost our Christian mind and are not viewing God's world through Christian spectacles, past and present, then we shan't be interested at all in the loss of a Christian memory. That's nothing to do with life. And I would like to speak about the seriousness of the latter, that is the loss of a Christian memory, and particularly as it may affect students and those in the 20 to 30 bracket. Now, church history, or as I prefer to call it, Christian history, there's nothing wrong with the title church history. It's been used for hundreds of years. But Christian history, it is, or should be, even with its faults and failings. Christian history is largely neglected, as in some quarters, as I've said, is the academic discipline of history itself. Yet, to my delight, and I've mentioned this, to my delight, and I hope yours, TV programs about archaeology, they fascinate people. Now, the contemporary philosophy, as I've just mentioned, of postmodernism, has abandoned any absolutes. That is, there is an absolute truth. There is an absolute righteousness. There is an absolute truth, and all that springs from that. And certain certainties, and relativized them, lowered them down, or eliminated altogether. We don't notice that when we go into supermarkets or walking up and down the streets. But in people's conversation and within families, that's another matter altogether. And thus, truth has deteriorated into something that becomes a matter of opinion. Truth is nowadays a matter of opinion, except for the Christian believer. You have your truth, I have mine. Right and wrong do not enter the discussion, something right or wrong, or something better or worse, or something that did happen or did not happen. That's irrelevant. Now, why has this happened? Well, I think there are several reasons, and this is just a little skirmish, not a full-scale battle on this subject. In the first place, what I'd call injurious aspects of Greek and Renaissance thinking have come full circle. Greek and Renaissance thinking, which is man is the measure of all things. We must start with modernism, modernistic, postmodernism. Man, woman is the measure of all things. Secondly, well, yes, it follows from that. Man is the measure of all things. Secondly, the God-given unity of knowledge has been overthrown. Let me illustrate that. The God-given unity of knowledge, that God is the author of history. I don't know whether I mentioned this morning, but I was talking to somebody last night, I think it was, perhaps, that God is the Lord of history. He permits history. He promotes history. He may prevent history. God is the Lord of history, and he'll eventually wind it up. He created it. He created it, and he will terminate it. And that will be world history and all sorts of other histories we've never heard of, that he alone knows in the Almighty's mind. God is the Lord of history. We need to understand that, and we need to do some thinking about it and see how that works out in our own lives. That's, I think, is one of the starting places. The other place to start is, as I mentioned, I think it was the other night. I hope it wasn't this morning, otherwise my memory is in desperate shape. Not only believing Christians believe that this was so, there's no evidence, as it were, to prove that it's so, but we believe that it's so. But non-Christians believe this too. You think of the Spanish Armada. If the Armada had not been routed by Drake and his sailors, his navy, then England would have become a Roman Catholic country. And it would doubtless still remain as a Roman Catholic country. Be that as it may, we were spared becoming a Roman Catholic country. I'm not saying anything about Roman Catholics. I'm talking about the system. Then another example from that would be the belief that many Christians have, and those of us who lived through the Second World War, that D-Day, that the sea calmed down sufficiently to allow us to do D-Day. Because if D-Day had not, if the American and the British and the Allied forces had not been able to get onto those beaches in France, and been pushed back into the sea, the Germans would have come over and England would have been captured entirely, lock, stock and barrel. And we were spared that. We were spared that. We were spared another event during the war, when the bombing of London that had been taking place for, I don't know, a whole month, night after night, something of that nature, of that kind, suddenly stopped. And the reason it stopped was because Hitler had decided that that this was not successful enough. The British hadn't caved in, so he gave the orders to invade Russia. And so the whole of the German army went eastward instead of coming westward. It looks as though God has his favourites. I don't know. I'm not prepared to say that. I don't think he does. But it looks as though God had a hand in that. But we can never say that with certainty. We can simply thank God that we weren't invaded and that certain events did not take place. And just quietly leave it at that and not be dogmatic and say the hand of God unmistakably was there. Perhaps it was, but we do not know. Another factor that shows the neglect of history is that process that took a step forward in the 17th century when Louis Marary, a Frenchman, produced an encyclopedia. There's nothing unusual in that, but this was arranged in alphabetical order. Until then, encyclopedias were arranged according to the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, and the celestial kingdom. In the 18th century, Denis Diderot's encyclopedia also had the entries arranged in alphabetical order. Now that was a move in Enlightenment thinking and was especially significant for a simple, clear reason. Nothing had its fixed place anymore. Nothing had its fixed place anymore. And this decline developed during the second half of the 19th century with the onset of the secular skepticism that arose from the theories of Darwin, Marx and Freud. And remember, when we Christians, all of us are talking about people, let's be quite sure we're talking about their systems and their theories and not in any way denigrating them. Darwin, Marx and Engels and Freud and the rest of them are made in the image of God just as you and I are. In the 20th century, the skepticism began to be real skepticism, and it tightened into logical positivism in the middle years of this century, then into what do you call it, existentialism in the 60s and the 70s. That's when Lebris, there was a piece of timing for you, I think. God's timing again, I think, acting into history, though we can't say so with certainty, except that God was so present in the establishing of Lebris in the 60s. That was a crucial time when all those revolting students, by which I mean students who were revolting, not revolting students, who were revolting against the establishment and against things they didn't like, and there were some things that needed to be dealt with, my word, yes, were flocking up the mountainside to Lebris, coming from the United States and European countries, especially England, and coming in their hundreds during those 60s years, and some of you were part of that when you were younger. It's not accidental, I think, that Lebris was started at the time to meet those needs. Also, during the second half of the 19th century, secular skepticism was paralleled, of course, by theological skepticism, propounded by the German higher critics, people like Strauss and Ritschl and Wellhausen, greatly gifted theological scholars, but utterly up the creek. As a result, theological liberalism dominated religious thought during the first half of the last century. During half of the last century, that is the century in which I was born. And my parents were Methodists. They weren't Christians at that time. They were Methodists, and we went to a Methodist church where we heard a social gospel every Sunday. And the great Dr. Donald Soper, whom I got to know personally as a friend, and that was a great privilege, was absolutely wrapped up in this labor-intensive, as it were, social theory, that is really what the gospel is. But there was nothing there for anybody to eat. No food. And one effect of liberalism was doubt concerning the historicity of the Old Testament and the miraculous and otherworldly aspects of Christianity. So the foundations of Christian history were well and truly being shaken. And following the Second World War, modernism, which believed in reason and order, but also in unrestrained capitalism and the status quo, was forced to beat a retreat, and postmodernism took over. And further factors since then have accelerated the state of amnesia about the Christian past. Confronted in the 60s by something we all regret, but did have advantages, it brought good things, was the permissive society and the spate of legislation that changed the course of our country's moral history. Let me list some of those things. There was the Lady Chatterley's Lover case, when that book that had been banned except in France and other countries, where you could get your copies if you wanted to, was now made free free to buy in this country. The loosening of the gambling laws. Much easier divorce. 2 pieces of legislation about divorce, separated by about 20 years, and the second one making it much easier. The reduction to the age of 16 of the homosexual age of consent, down to 16, and the total abolition of theatre censorship. Those are some of the things. That some of the legislation that came into being in the early 60s. So, in the face of that, many Christians seem to have lost their nerve, and they retreated into a sort of church area of activity rather than being salt and light in a larger heathen world. And confronted again by benign pluralism and a malign relativism, many Christians still today have lost confidence in the unique power of the gospel, while some have buried their heads sadly in the sand. There's also, and I'm not speaking against charismatic people or charismatic churches, I'm speaking in general terms of the charismatic emphasis on immediate experiences and an exaggerated revivalism which can divert attention from the unfathomable and rich legacy of the Scriptures. Then there's another factor, and I've mentioned this already, I'll take it a bit further. Postmodernism's equivocal attitude to history, with an apparent unwillingness, studied unwillingness, to profit from the past. Anything to do with us that's happened in the last 5 minutes is neither here nor there. It's the future, the present, the future, they merge together. We create our own future in the present. And the past never have anything to do with the past. It has nothing to do with you. It's finished and done with. We live in the present, and whatever you want to do in the present, you do. I once saw a T-shirt that had this message on it. All T-shirts have a message, by the way, every single one. And this one said, "History begins and ends with me." I thought, boy, what a tremendous statement that is. How appalling, absolutely appalling. You think about it. History begins and ends with me. And riding on the back of postmodernism, purpose and meaning have been unhorsed and trampled on. And as a result, we are dislocated from any meaningful connections that have anything to do with pasts of any time, of any kind. Popular intellectual media hype seems intent on embracing only the future, not the present, and certainly not the past, pasts of any kind. Now the waters, I think, were muddied further by ignorance and nonsense about the millennium, which of course was not the millennium. It was simply a millennium. But people got it all wrong, because the church hadn't told them, or whatever we mean by the church, hadn't told them what millennium means. A final factor, though there may be others, is the mesmeric influence and impetus of information technology that appears to short-circuit, as it were, to short-circuit time, insisting on the validity only of the present, which in turn is swiftly superseded ad infinitum. These then are some of the reasons for the initial decline and virtual disappearance of the memory of Christian history. And another reason, and I say this very gently and genuinely, the singing of songs to the almost abolition of singing the old hymns is all part of this process of losing our Christian memory. The singing of songs from a screen instead of from a hymn book. In every good hymn book, you saw at the bottom of a hymn, you see at the bottom of a hymn the name of the author, and when he lived, and when he died. And that tells you something. It tells you a lot about why that hymn was written and what the climate surrounding, the climate of opinion, the climate in England or Scotland, wherever it was at that time, was what it was like. But you can't do that anymore. You look at the screen and you sing from that. There again, I yield to no one in my appreciation of quite a number of these modern songs that one sees on the screen. I think they are deep and profound and helpful. But I would say not so helpful as people seem to think if you disregard the great hymns. The great hymns are part of the great history, the great Christian history of this country, and of countries where hymns have been created by early Christians, and other Christians from other countries through the centuries. They become part of our heritage, and we disregard them at our peril. One could say, but not make quite the same case quite so easily, for the many modern versions of the Bible. Believe it or not, there are over 40 different translations of the Bible, and you may say, how is that possible? What lunatics there must be in the Christian world who can produce 39 different versions of the Bible. I mean, genuinely, that's absolutely mind-boggling. I don't like that phrase, but it just comes to mind. What is there to say that hasn't been said? What are they saying? I don't know. It'll end up in. I don't know. It'll end up in French or something before we know where we are. Yes. These then are some of the reasons for the initial decline and virtual disappearance of the memory of Christian history. The amnesiac Western world stumbles confidently, yet arrogantly, into the future, hedging all its bets on progress, and progress in bad things as well as in what Christians would say are bad, harmful things for human beings as well as good things. Confident that the old is automatically the obsolete. That because a thing is old, it's finished with. It's finished with. Throw it away, it's for the dustbin. Anything that's old is for the dustbin. Your grandmother is for the dustbin, according to postmodernism. Now that last phrase is one of the wobbly pillars on which postmodernism rests. It's also the unspoken belief, as I've just said, held by many people regarding old people, generally, in general terms. It's also a trap that ensnares some Christians young in the faith, and it is to that matter that I now briefly turn. In the history of God's people in the Old Testament, there are repeated warnings and encouragement to them to remember this or that event, not to forget what happened on such and such an occasion, to take heed of this or that, so that it doesn't happen or that it does happen. Throughout the scriptures, there are approximately 350 references to not forgetting and to not remembering. Again and again comes God's phrase, you shall remember? No, stronger than that. You shall earnestly remember. Or another one, do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments. Every now and again, the people, the Jews, ask a question. This wonderful phrase that comes in Joshua, in the beginning of Joshua. When your sons ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and statutes and precepts which the Lord has commanded you? You shall tell them. You shall tell them. Following the crossing of the Jordan on dry land, Joshua had a heap of 12 stones, you remember, erected at Gilgal. And he said to as many people as could hear him, and the word would spread round, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? You shall tell them. What did those stones mean? A visible thing. Like our cathedrals are supposed to be visible objects of Christian truth. In Ecclesiastes, there is that ringing warning to young believers and young unbelievers alike. Earnestly remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Because if Satan succeeds in getting in when you're young, look out. On one occasion, Jesus asked some Pharisees, have you never read in the Scriptures? Paul, in his letter to the Christians at Philippi, is so strong when he says, to keep writing to you over and over of the same things is not irksome to me and is a precaution for your safety. Could things be clearer? With Paul and the other apostles, what is known as church history begins and is still continuing. Church history has been called the spiritual side of the history of civilized peoples ever since the Lord Jesus' coming. And this, in part, is what we're talking about today. I don't like the name church history, it sounds too formal, but we're stuck with it, it's okay. But to read about it is thrilling. There's a book IVP published some years ago, not many years ago, it's up to date, called The Story of the Church. It's a paperback, not expensive, by the son of the man who wrote the first book that IVP published on the story of the church, Renwick, A.M. Renwick, R-E-N-W-I-C-K, and Harman, H-A-R-M-A-N. And this in part what we're discussing today. It's essential to know the highs and the lows, the triumphs and the tragedies, because we then see that when we know the lows and the highs, not just the one or the other, but both, we begin to see, well, yes, that's beginning my life. It's a bit of our church life and what life is like. We really begin to see we're in the flow of biblical history, of Christian history. It begins with the apostles, does Christian history. It moves to the early Christian centuries, Augustine and company, to the Middle Ages. I'm jumping to the Middle Ages, to the Reformation, which was not simply an historical period in Germany, but in Switzerland, Scotland, as well as England. Then the Counter-Reformation, followed by the Church in subsequent centuries. Now, all this having been said, I'm certain that the great Dr. Samuel Johnson was right when he said that it is often more important for people to be reminded than to be informed. To be reminded than to be informed. We forget, at least I'm speaking for myself, but probably for you, dear people, we forget so easily. And the farther something is away, we tend to forget more. As one looks back through the arches of the years, through the sweep of history, both biblical and secular, one cannot but observe that one consequence of skepticism and blinkered views about history is that matters rooted in the Judeo-Christian legacy of the West, for example, marriage and the family, have been derided and ignored. Partly because of the loss of a Christian memory, the here and now is a time of real testing for those of us who are believers, for our beliefs and for our living. To testing, we have to add deepening spiritual and intellectual confusion, moral anarchy that reminds you of ancient Rome, and degradation, which banners flutter throughout the Western world. In this situation, the question is a Christian memory important? Is it worth fighting for? The answer is, indeed it is. For we have been irresponsible, and we shall be accountable to God. Surely we shall be for this. We have been irresponsible in our forgetfulness of Christian history, and that works to our detriment in 4 ways. And I'll mention those in a moment, just to interpolate one thing that's just occurred to me, and if I don't say it now, I won't say it at all. It's not all that important, but it's interesting. That a poll held in the European Union recently came to the conclusion that the most atheistic country in the world, in the Western world, was Great Britain. Now you can take that for what it's worth. Polls lie, they're half-truths, they may tell some of the truth. But the fact that a poll was held at all to ask which nation is the most atheistic says something in and of itself. So, it's irresponsible for our forgetfulness of Christian history, and that works to our detriment in 4 ways. First, we may be unaware of, or perhaps even unconcerned about, the seriousness of the heresies and mistakes in the church that have arisen in our day, as they do in every generation, and the manner in which they have been or are being treated. Past failures and successes provide valuable insights into the possible present outcome of various decisions and actions. What I mean is this: when we turn our backs on history, we deprive ourselves of the light that illuminated earlier Christians' problems and will ours. The Jewish nation was repeatedly urged by God, as we've seen, to remember that He is there, to remember that he is, to recollect that neither he nor his word can lie, to recall his metaphysical and moral attributes, to remind themselves that he is sovereign and he will see his people through to the end. Recorded also in Scripture are the disastrous and painful consequences to an entire nation of individuals of forgetting to remember. In particular, the books of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel and the Psalms, let alone Jesus' repeated appeals to the past, and Paul's, are replete with references both to disobedience and negligence, not to speak of the consequences, on the part of God's people. So we've had ample warning. Secondly, our century has steadily eroded the concept of absolute truth in the person of the God of the Bible. And when that disappears, morality is relativized, largely because those virtues seem to be unknown, and both believers and non-believers suffer. Edmund Burke's warning is dire, and I use the word in its proper meaning, is dire. They will not look forward to their posterity, who never look back to their ancestry. With Christian truth undermined, Christian morality can find no foothold. And the result of ignoring history is, as the great American historian Gertrude Himmelfarb says, to void it of moral content, to mitigate evil and belittle greatness. Thirdly, we are bereft of heroes and heroines. In their place, we've substituted celebrities, sportsmen and women, TV personalities, and society figures who, let us ever remember, like us, are made as the image of God. Real heroism postulates first and foremost men and women of character, greatness of soul, who in some pursuit or activity, great or small, exhibit courage and act honourably. Real heroism is of those qualities. Among Christians, there are also those who have, in the words of Scripture, risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. What a heritage you and I have of those who've gone to the stake and who've perished in all sorts of different ways throughout the running centuries. Of those who have conquered through the blood of the Lamb and through the word of their testimony. And in Revelation that sentence ends, nor did they cherish life, even in the face of death. And if we are Christians, none of us should imagine that we can avoid making one of two choices: character or cowardice. Character or cowardice. That's why I said last night to the kids, and would keep on saying it, courage, I think, is the greatest virtue of many virtues that you need to cultivate and be sure you have and practice these days. We should imagine courage and honour of a high order are required in the King's service. Beginning with the heroes and the heroines immortalized in Hebrews chapter 11, marvellous chapter, and then running through the running centuries, there's the unqualified necessity to take one's stand. To take one's stand beside Martin Luther. Here stand I can no other, so help me God. It is great events And great people, I mean not only famous people, but great little people, like ourselves, that define the life and memory of a nation. When its landmarks are removed, not only does it lose its sense of direction, it doesn't know what its destination is. That changes. And these truths are clearly illustrated by studying, for example, the condition of England in the 18th century before John Wesley, and the condition of England after him. Fourthly, without a grasp of history, our steps as a nation will be hesitant and pragmatic. The future we cannot study, but the past we have studied and can set it alongside the present to remind us, as C.S. Lewis said, that the basic assumptions have been different in different periods. So much which seems certain is temporary fashion. And the realization of that and their knowledge and understanding of history made, for example, Winston Churchill and General de Gaulle wiser guides to their respective countries than most of their contemporaries. Without an historical perspective, we'll be unsure of what to think, how to think, and in what direction to go. And we need, as small examples, not to overlook the significance of ceremonies, anniversaries, place, our association with the land. We may also forget to remember our cornucopian spiritual, intellectual, legal, constitutional, archaeological, architectural, musical, artistic, literary, and scientific legacy, among other achievements, which are also strongly woven into the warp and the woof of our national histories. Awareness of the past reminds us of who we are now, where we are going or should be going. It provokes in the believer humility as we respect and wish to learn from those who have gone before us. Of those who have gone or are still. They may have one foot in the grave, but they're still going before us. It provokes humility as we respect and wish to learn from those who've gone before us. And it should rejuvenate fresh vision and purpose, helping us not only to move forward, but to look up and, in a sense, to look beyond what we actually see. As the poet Henry Vaughan wrote, "My soul, there is a country far beyond the stars, where stands a winged sentry, all skillful in the wars." But you may ask me, what else do you see in the dark backward and abysm of time? From Christian history, we may observe 5 crucial responsibilities, I think, and there may be more, but here are 5 for our time. First, following Stephen, Paul, and the other apostles, are the joyfulness and confidence of the early church. Yes, persecution. Yes, persecution. The arena, the animals in the arena devouring you. Yes, yes, all that. But joyfulness and confidence. Do we have both those virtues, both those qualities? Those believers in the early church were gripped by the glorious truth of that remarkable theologian Tertullian. His paradox, which concerns the resurrection and our resurrection. It's simple, it goes like this. He said of the resurrection and our resurrection bodies, it is certain. In other words, this truth is certain. Why? Because it's impossible. I mean, there's no answer to that. That's just wonderful. Of the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection, Tertullian's paradox. It is certain because it is impossible. And only persecution and death loosened the grip, and will loosen the grip for us. In the providence of God, there's always a faithful remnant who are witnesses to the truth. As you and I hear that, as I hear myself saying it, and you hear my saying it, take it to yourself that if it comes to the crunch, yes, you will be one of the faithful remnant, no matter what they do to you. Tertullian also said, the more you mow us down, the more we grow. The seed is the blood of Christians. As we look back at the martyrs, as you go into a cemetery perhaps, to bring it nearer home, and see some of the texts that were written in the 19th and the very early part of the last century, or maybe most of the last century. But seldom have you noticed that in cemeteries and churchyards is there any biblical text on any tombstone. It's some humanistic, well-meant, much loved and respectful words, but not biblical texts. You go through the average churchyard and you'll see that from this century and from up to the end of the Second World War. From then onwards, we become an atheistic or an agnostic, a postmodern, call what you like, society. And it's even found its way, of course it's found its way into the tombstones. The seed is the blood of Christians. The seed of the martyrs is the blood of Christians. And I'm prepared to be a martyr. I don't want to be. The idea of being burnt at the stake or its modern equivalent is abhorrent. But all of us, each of us, got to be prepared for that. Prepared for that. Not to be frightened of it. Who are we looking to? Man? No, we're looking to Christ. Christ, Christ, Christ. Only Christ. And He will see us safely through, as He saw the disciples through, as He saw us all, as He's seen men and women through the running centuries. We're part of that heritage. Those people, those early Christians, and all who've gone before us who were in union with the Lord Jesus Christ, were, in Augustine's phrase, resident aliens. It's a grand phrase, that. Living in enemy-occupied territory, as it were, which is C.S. Lewis's way of describing it. We're living in enemy-occupied territory. Resident aliens. We don't belong here. But God has placed us here, and we're to be used in such and such a way until we go to meet with Him. They did not forget. They did not forget to remember the rock from which they were hewn. And we too, in our generation, should covenant with God to be prepared to die for the truth. Secondly, and I say this carefully, even from the time of the apostles, when the gospel first took root and spread, different persons and different groups have fallen into heresy, contributing to error and further excess. Roman Catholicism and other denominations too, and movements have departed from the faith in one way or another. Let us be sure that we do not contribute to that. It's nothing to be proud of, unless it was absolutely essential according to the Scriptures. Third thing to remember, the Christian church is, or should be, a missionary church. The gospel is not philosophy. advice or therapy. It's good news, not to be hoarded, kept inside. Its largesse is to be distributed far and near. As Leslie Newbegin said, the gospel is public truth. The gospel is public truth, not private hugging, consisting of evangelism, apologetics, pastoring, a threefold commission given by Jesus to his people until he comes again. It's not a private religion or a personal belief. It is public truth, and it's demonstrated visibly to be so when it is lived publicly. Fourthly, God has graciously chosen and continues to choose, call and equip certain men and women to be leaders among his people. Biblical history shows also that there are no little people and no little places. Schaeffer preached a sermon on those very words. Lovely words. No little people. No insignificant people. What a horrible word to think of in terms of people, a person. And no little places. You work in a small office, or you stay at home most of the day. No little places. No unimportant work. No insignificant vocation. Absolutely not. Each person is precious. Each vocation is vital. Each one is to put his or her shoulder to the wheel. And as far as possible, each one of us is to give support and cheer to those who bear the heat and burden of the day, especially those in the public eye who are belittled or pressured on account of their stand for the truth, even though they may not be specifically Christian. They are standing for what they know to be the truth, or understand to be the truth. One of my friends is the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Sir John Stevens. He was one of the boys I taught and one of my prefects in my house. And he's a believer. He doesn't make a public declaration about it. You've got to be careful in that position. But he's a believer, and those who work with him know that perfectly well. And we pray for somebody like that. And we pray for somebody whom we know is a milkman, who is a believer, that he'll deliver his milk well and properly, as it were. He'll do his job. And a housewife and a husband going out to work, slogging away day after day in a dusty office. Yes, some of you here, especially the younger ones, are leaders, potential leaders, and you have a right. I hate to use that. I don't like using that word. It's used so often. I have a right to this, I have a right to that. My generation knew nothing about rights. We knew a great deal about duties, though. You have a right, though, to expect the rest of us to believe in you and to pray for you, to love you and support you. Fifthly, let us be clear in understanding that God is the sole Lord of history, seen and unseen. A history that is not going round and round and round, cyclical, but as it were, as Tennyson wrote, one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. Isaiah affirms that the nations are as a drop in a bucket, and God picks up the islands as a very little thing. History is in God's safekeeping and under his control. He preceded it. He created it. As Martin Lloyd-Jones put it, there are two strands to it: that which God permits and that which he promotes. He works within it. He will terminate it. And these eternal truths revealed in Scripture reassure the children of God as they have reassured each generation that wishes to be reassured that history and the universe are under God's sovereignty. I trust we comprehend the crucial importance of a Christian memory and the necessity to transmit it and keep on transmitting it to the next and the next and the next generation until Christ comes. Yet, the loss of the Christian memory is not confined to the past. It reaches into the present with a vengeance. Wherever contemporary thinking in any age has infected the consciousness of men and women, it has automatically affected behavior. As has been said, it's such a succinct, easy thing to remember. A man is not what he thinks he is, what he thinks he is. Man is not what he thinks he is, what he thinks he is. And when thinking is altered, behavior is adjusted, shall we say. It is changed. And that's clearly observable in recent and in current British history following the Second World War, during which time the permissive society began its gathering rush throughout the nation, which shows no sign of stopping. I repeat, the loss of a Christian memory is not confined to the past. It reaches right into this present day. So, I carefully ask, not in any way excluding those who are older in our meeting today, but are you young men and women aware that your Christian birthright has been largely forgotten? Do you want to know about the past? Is it important? I have attempted to answer the last question. Those who have travelled a little longer, and I trust a little further, must impress the great importance of this matter on the growing generation. I first became aware of this situation many years ago when invited to speak at the University Christian Union, and on frequent occasions since, both in the UK and the US. It's exactly the same over there. The common factor, generally speaking, the likeness throughout, is perhaps the basic problem is an unawareness or an unwillingness to acknowledge the crucial necessity for knowing and implementing biblical doctrine. Biblical doctrine. Not biblical truth, but in doctrines are the truth, of course. Not a vague phrase, biblical truth, but biblical doctrine. This has several results when young people and older people don't know biblical doctrine. Perhaps in the first instance they're not aware of what the word doctrine means, and that needs explaining carefully, not in any divisive way. Oh, come, surely you know what doctrine is. People don't know what doctrine is, and we need a lot of gentleness, gentle firmness. Several results, and here are 6 of them. And I'm speaking principally of young people, not you young people here, bless you, but those I've known and the many in the Christian world. The first problem, first result, is that young Christians on the whole, in my experience, going around universities and privileged to do that, is that they have a very flabby knowledge concerning the Bible. It's a flabby thing. Secondly, they have an unbiblical grasp of conversion. Thirdly, a feeble understanding of faith. A perfunctoriness in prayer. Sometimes an alarming approach to guidance, and sometimes a seriously compromised Christian living. And at some time, most of us have experienced some of those things. But they were rectified through an awareness and application of biblical teaching, which is nowhere near so prevalent as it used to be. I hate the phrase, and you hate it even more, when I was a boy. As Milton wrote, the hungry sheep look up and are not fed today. And have we not realized yet that today's students are tomorrow's parents and leaders? In conclusion, I wish briefly to consider how this amnesia, this whole matter, might be addressed. To begin with, let us ever thankfully remember the unpayable debt we owe to the men and women in biblical and secular history who through the centuries persevered in finishing their course and handing on their legacy. Never can we thank God enough for those early Christians and those who through the centuries, many names inscribed famously, as it were, in history, but all the great little people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, ordinary folk like ourselves. Secondly, we have a solemn responsibility to hand on that legacy, which is our legacy, to our descendants, and they in turn to their descendants. Pupils and students need specific teaching of what that inheritance consists, so that in due course they will pass that on to their students, to their children. Thirdly, I suggest we are to announce the magnitude of the benefits of that heritage, which is a heritage for the entire nation. It's not just for a group here and a group there. You know as well as I do that Britain has a heritage, Christian heritage, that goes back 1,400 years. And in some local towns, we're not allowed to have crosses on our hot cross buns. And our heritage goes back 1,400 years, and we're selling it. I'm not saying anything against Muslims. I'm merely talking about English people who would have more sense. Fourthly, as far as lies in our power, let us inform writers and media people and publishers, and some of you may fit into that category in the present and in the future, of this Christian legacy, and urge them responsibly to make it known through the media over which they have charge. At the same time, we are to acknowledge and confess guilt and error at numerous times throughout that history for some atrocious actions and misplaced zeal. Perhaps some of you, could you not write a weekly or a monthly article for your local newspaper? Fifthly, we should take firm issue with the prevailing culture and show to people when they're talking with them, because the subject comes up, oh, aren't things terrible? Did you read about so-and-so the other day in that street? It comes up in all sorts of different forms, little ways and big ways. Show why Christianity is public truth. At the same time, drawing a line between, don't misunderstand me, but it's an important distinction between Christianity and Christ. There is a divisive, different line very often between Christianity and Christ. I don't like the word Christianity because it is so tarnished. It's been so dirtied throughout the centuries by Christians as well as by non-Christians. But we must take issue with the prevailing culture and show why Christianity is public truth. 1,400 years. Ah, but nobody believes in it. Listen, you're not hearing me, you're not listening to me, you say to your friends. And you put your case. And this is important in and of itself, but especially in this context. The known and the unknown heroes and heroines of the Christian faith did what they did and lived as they lived and died as they died, not on behalf of Christianity, but for belief in and love for Jesus Christ. That's why they went to the stake and were eaten by the lions. Sixthly, we should encourage students and others to long for spiritual nourishment through getting to know the deep and essential doctrines of Scripture, and not in ephemeral experiences, and to find loving, sane churches where the gospel is preached and to the best of their ability, with God's help, believers are living it. Martin Lloyd-Jones has 3 volumes, paperbacks, small paperbacks, but packed with typical MLJ good stuff, biblical stuff, on the doctrines of the Bible. He goes through them all. So there's no excuse. Cheap paperbacks, the Doctrines of the Bible series. I forget who publishes it, but any good bookseller will get them for you. Lastly, we are not to be disappointed or despair if these objectives are not fully achieved. God does not ask us to be successful. He asks us only to be faithful and persistent. And persistent. He doesn't ask us to be successful. Only faithful and persistent. He has given us his multitudinous promises. He is sovereign. What does the psalmist say? They looked to him and were lightened. And the consequence? Their faces were not ashamed. They looked to him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. Jesus, in one of his parables, says, we know these words so well, well done, good and faithful, not successful, servant. Finally, a rhetorical question, is a Christian memory important for Christians? Indeed it is. Are you teaching the next generation now those immemorial facts of biblical history and the enduring truths that hinge on and emerge from them? Kierkegaard warns us that it is not worthwhile remembering that past which cannot become a present. It is not worthwhile remembering that past which cannot become a present. From century to century, nation to nation, generation to generation, from the growing up now generation, the biblical and Christian birthright, we must pass it on. G.K. Chesterton rightly observed that any man who is cut off from the past is a man most unjustly disinherited. He's right. The German poet Goethe was even more emphatic. He who cannot call upon the last 3,000 years has to live from hand to mouth. He's exaggerating, doubtless, to make a point. May God help us all, each Christian soul here, to become, in W.H. Auden's splendid, simple words, an affirming flame. Thank you.